Welcome, everyone. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum. Peace and blessings be upon all of you. This is quite a pleasure to continue this Ramadan webinar series sponsored by the Center for Islam and Global Affairs, CIGA, and especially during the last few days of Ramadan. It's quite an honor to have an of a public intellectual like Dr. Chandra Muzaffar join us, a mentor, certainly a voice, prominent voice in the global justice movement. And let me say something about myself. My name is Dr. Junaid S. Ahmed. I teach religion, law, and politics in Islamabad, Pakistan. And I've also been a member of JUST and worked with JUST as well, the organization with which Dr. Chandra is the president. So let me give a brief introduction of Dr. Chandra Muzaffar. Dr. Chandra Muzaffar is the president of the International Movement for a Just World, an international NGO based in Malaysia, which seeks to critique global injustice and to develop an alternative vision of a just and compassionate civilization guided by universal spiritual and moral values. He has published extensively on civilizational dialogue, international politics, religion, human rights, and Malaysian society. The author and editor of 32 books in English and Malay, many of his writings have been translated in other languages. Among Dr. Chandra's latest publications are A World in Crisis, Is There a Cure? And Reflections on Malaysian Unity and Challenges. In 1977, he founded a multi-ethnic social reform group called Akran Kedran Negara, which he led for 14 years. Today, apart from his role from JUST, Dr. Chandra is on the board of a number of international NGOs concerned with social justice and civilizational dialogue. Dr. Chandra was professor and director of the Center for Civilizational Dialogue, University of Malaya from 1997 to 1999, and professor of global studies at the University of Saint Malaysia. Dr. Chandra travels abroad frequently, giving lectures and speaking at seminars and conferences. He's also a regular speaker at meetings at home in Malaysia. Dr. Chandra is the recipient of a number of international awards related to his scholarship and social activism. Dr. Chandra is right now, as I said, the president of International Movement for a Just World, JUST, and I had a proud association with JUST as well and continue to do so. And as I said at the beginning, it is quite an honor to have one of the most prominent voices and public intellectuals in the world in the global justice movement with us. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Dr. Chandra. And once again, thanks to CIGA, Dr. Sami, and all of the staff there for organizing this tremendous webinar series throughout our holy month of Ramadan. Thank you. Please, Dr. Chandra, the floor is yours.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum. Peace be with you. Let me begin by thanking Dr. Sami and the Center for Islamic and Global Affairs for this very kind invitation. It's indeed a pleasure to be in this program with my dear friend Junaid, and it's also a pleasure to have known other people associated with this program like Yunus. Friends, I should perhaps clarify the title before dealing with the substantive issues that we will talk about this afternoon. Now, as far as the title is concerned, we talk of the impact of the coronavirus crisis, the calamity, upon Muslims. But we have to be absolutely certain that it is not just Muslims who have been impacted by the virus. It is global in its impact, it's universal. It is a health crisis which is almost unique in history in terms of its casualties, its infections, and most of all, its consequences for the present and the future. The economy, politics, culture, ethnic relations, perhaps even gender relations, well into the future. What I'd like to do is to perhaps look at 5 areas which are important as far as Muslims are concerned, but also for others, for people of other faiths and people who do not subscribe to any particular religious community. What are the 5 areas I want to focus upon? These are areas which I think have become significant because of the calamity. And at the same time, they are significant in terms of the future of humankind. The first of the 5 areas, the environment. There is some discussion in the media about the link to the environment, meaning by which that as a result of the crisis, you find that there are less users of vehicles on the roads, there's less pollution, the rivers are cleaner, the air is cleaner, and people are saying, well, this is not a bad thing. If as a result of this crisis, the environment seems to be a little cleaner. Actually, the relationship with the environment is quite profound. There are those who would argue that perhaps even the virus and its role, its relationship to animals, to human beings, perhaps the way it is transmitted from maybe animals to human beings, these are issues which require deeper understanding. Let us not forget that the virus has been here much longer than us. Like all the other germs and bacteria, microbes and so on, they've been part of nature. And it may be because we haven't really developed a profound relationship with nature that we continue to rape and ravage the environment. And it may be because of our inability to comprehend the boundaries within nature and the boundaries that impact upon the animal world and human beings that perhaps this crisis developed the way it did. We don't know, because there's a lot about the origin of this particular crisis that we are still trying to fathom. And there's a lot of politics behind this too. Nonetheless, I think this is an important area that we should look at. That's number 1. Number 2, the crisis has also brought to the fore relationships among ourselves as human beings. Our relationship with people who are not like us, who are different. And right from the outset, this was something that emerged because a very prominent politician described the virus as the Chinese virus. And then he said it was the Wuhan virus. And we know that members of the Chinese community had been targeted in various parts of the world to abuse, to the xenophobia, which disgraces the human race, but it has happened. So feelings of hatred, of venom, of apprehension, of fear, of prejudice, all these things have emerged in the relationship between people who are different in terms of their culture, their religion, their ethnic and racial backgrounds. And that, I think, is yet another dimension that is very important, because we have had problems with relationships with those who are not like us, the other, for a long, long while, since time immemorial. It has now taken on yet another coloring, and for that reason we have to pay attention to this. A third dimension, again in the realm of relationships, this time not the other as it's conventionally understood, the relationship with people who are from a different socioeconomic background. And that again had emerged in the course of this crisis, because we cannot run away from the fact that in a number of countries, those who have been most badly affected by the crisis are people in the lower rungs of society, the poorer, the dispossessed, the disadvantaged, the disenfranchised. They are the ones who have been impacted by this crisis. In the United States of America, in Britain, it is obvious. Even in a country like Singapore, a country in the global south, which is quite highly developed in the conventional sense, and many of the victims are foreign workers who are right at the bottom of society. And this is something that should set us thinking. The impact of a health crisis like this, like other types of crisis, upon the poor. And what does it tell us about our society, about the type of world we are in? That the poor have to bear the burden of sufferings of this sort. What does it tell us about our quest for justice, for fairness, if this is the reality? And the reality in very rich societies, this is happening. So that should set us thinking. A fourth dimension that is related to this. The coronavirus calamity has also brought to the fore the whole question of governance, which is related to both the second, the third dimensions, and even the first dimension. It is basically a question of governance. How are we managing our societies? How do we manage our structures, our institutions, our various procedures and protocols, which are all part of the way our societies are? How do we fulfill our responsibilities, which is also part of governance, as leaders, as elites, as people who have more power than the others? How are we exercising this power? How are we fulfilling our trust, which is fundamental to governance? Because at the heart of governance is the question of trust. At the heart of governance is the question of our responsibility to others. How are we fulfilling this? And this is a critical question. Governance has come to the fore because you can see in the midst of this crisis, there are societies which have done fairly well in managing this crisis because they're well managed, because they're well governed. They've had health systems that have worked quite well for decades. They allocate a lot of their resources to health and education, and they have had mechanisms and arrangements which have been tested from time to time, and they have put them into practice in the midst of this crisis, and they are effective in ensuring that the people at the bottom in particular don't suffer unnecessarily. But some others have not done that well, including societies which are wealthy and affluent, and including societies which at one time had fairly good health systems. But because they have emphasized privatization and deregulation and liberalization, they're now paying the price. And the price is that a lot more people are suffering as a result of this crisis. Now that's something which has come to the fore, also in relation to governance, in relation to leadership. A fifth and final dimension that has come to the fore. The calamity has also shown us what international politics is. It has told us a little more about the workings of the global system. It has also shown us in a very blatant way how geopolitics has become enmeshed in this calamity. In fact, there are people who would argue that maybe right from the beginning, geopolitics had a very big role. It was not just a health crisis, there was a geopolitical dimension right from the beginning. China was targeted. I wrote an article on this on the 4th of February about the targeting of China as a very important dimension of this crisis. And we have seen how it has worked and how it has unfolded over the last 4 months. The tussle between the United States and China. It's a tussle for power. Some would argue it is perhaps a tussle for dominance and control. Perhaps. And that is at the heart of international politics and geopolitics. So you can see that this calamity, tragic as it is, in terms of its impact upon human lives, tens of thousands have died, and many more will die. This crisis has actually also brought to the fore issues that are so fundamental to our existence on this planet. Having outlined 5 of these dimensions, let me now ask myself how they're related to Islam and to Muslims, since that is the theme that we are dealing with. But I want to emphasize yet again that it's not just Muslims. It's people of all different faiths who are impacted by this crisis. And it is related to their faiths also, as I'll allude to in a while. But in the case of Islam, let's begin with the 5th of the 5 dimensions we talked about. Geopolitics, the question of geopolitics and international politics, and what is Islam's position on this. At the root of geopolitics is dominance, power, control, hegemony. Islam is against hegemony. Islam regards hegemony as the antithesis of humanity, as the antithesis of justice, of compassion. It is the antithesis of doing well, good, looking after everyone. That's hegemony. And Islam cannot accept a system which perpetuates hegemony. Which is why I would argue that if we are going to reflect on this from an Islamic perspective, we should strengthen our resolve to overcome the problem of hegemony. Hegemony has intruded so many different areas of life. We've seen it in relation to this health crisis, but it's everywhere. And hegemony has led to so much suffering. I don't have to narrate all the tragedies we've gone through in the last so many decades. from Korea and Vietnam to Iraq and Libya and Palestine and Syria and all the other crises. Not forgetting the crises that our brothers and sisters in Latin America have had to face for much longer a while. Crises related to Argentina, to Chile, to Brazil at different points in history, Nicaragua, Bolivia, where nations have been dominated, controlled, they've lost their independence, they've become subservient serfs to the powerful on this earth. So that, I think, is how it has a very direct relationship with Islam in the question of hegemony and dominance, and why it is so important for us to take a very strong position against this. Let me very quickly look at one particular dimension, because it's very much in the news, about hegemony and why we have to take a strong position against this. You know, the World Health Organization has been accused of being pro-China, of being a stooge of the Chinese government. Now, the WHO is a world institution that has done good work in many respects. We can quarrel with certain aspects of its work, but nonetheless, it has got a fairly good record. The United States is the biggest funder of the WHO. Here's a question of the person who funds the organization trying to call its due. And they were not happy that the WHO told the truth about what had happened right from the beginning. You can go back and look at what the WHO has said, what the recent assembly revealed, and you can look at records produced by other nations. The WHO was telling the truth about the information it had, what it made public, and how it tried to fight this crisis. But the very fact that the most powerful nation on earth, the hegemon, the global hegemon, can now tarnish the WHO, smear the name of the WHO, simply because the WHO tried to be objective and honest in its work, which is what the hegemonic global system will not accept. If you try to be fair, you pay a price. So the US has decided to cut off funding. That's the price. Remember what it did to UNESCO many years ago? It removed funding. Again, a manifestation of hegemony. UNESCO is doing a good job. It is trying to give more attention to third world countries and to historical sites linked to third world countries. And that's something that the US was not happy about. Israel was not happy about it. And the US pulled out of UNESCO. So this is the way in which the hegemon tries to manipulate and subvert international institutions. One of the goals of a non-hegemonic world, of a more equitable and just world, is to evolve global institutions that are fair and just to everyone, where the rule of law prevails. The rule of law cannot prevail as long as there's hegemony, as long as there is one center attempting to dominate the rest of the human family. So you see how important it is for us to combat this evil, the evil embodied by hegemony. And one hopes that this crisis, which has brought our civilization to a grinding halt, will persuade us to look more deeply at hegemony. The other dimension that I talked about was governance, how individual societies are managed all over the world, leadership. Here again, from an Islamic perspective, governance is very, very important. In our religion, honest leaders are very important. The ability of leaders to discharge their duties with a deep sense of justice and fairness and compassion, That's fundamental. We don't need to be told this. We know this. Islam is one of those religions that gives a lot of emphasis to just, upright, ethical leadership and governance that embodies those principles. And yet you will find that there are not many Muslim countries that can tell the world that their leadership is ethical, that their leadership lives up to Islamic standards. We're not talking about other standards, Islamic standards. And very often you find that amongst our elites, you have people who have very often betrayed the masses, who don't have the sort of commitment to, let alone justice and fairness, even to basic decency, the way in which they manage their national affairs. So that's something that we should also ponder about. Looking at the realities, looking at what is happening in various parts of the world, in the way in which they're handling the crisis, looking at how some Muslim countries are not doing well and some other Muslim countries are doing well, partly because there is good governance. We should be convinced that this is something that we should give a lot of emphasis to. It is a pity that we Muslims are more concerned about rituals and forms rather than issues of governance. Have we ever started a global movement on fighting corruption throughout the Muslim world, throughout the world? Have we? We haven't. But we have a more or less global movement. It was active at one time on the way women attire themselves, on the way our sisters dress. It is not unimportant, but nonetheless, you look at the way in which our priorities are set. What we are really concerned about is issues of this sort, form, symbols, rather than substance. I'll return to this towards the end of my talk. Friends, let me look at the other dimension that we talked about. This is about the rich and poor, the growing gap between rich and poor. It's all over the world. It's not just in Muslim countries, and Islam has always been concerned about this. I think it is remarkable that many of the practices which we just regard as practices in Islam, they're actually connected with justice, with redistribution of wealth. Look at the zakat. We're reminded of the zakat during this month, the month of Ramadan. The wealth tax of sorts. Look at faraid, the property division principles in Islam. Look at waqf, which is the bequeathal of what one has. Look at the banning of riba, interest, in its larger implications. It's not just interest as narrowly, formally understood. Look at the concept of siddiqah, of charity, again, very broadly understood. So all these things that Muslims are very familiar with, we know these things. These are our practices. They're all linked directly and indirectly to justice, to redistribution of wealth, to fairness. And yet we find that somehow this is something we forget. We, of course, do a bit of charity and we do pay our zakat and so on, but we don't understand the larger implications. What redistributing the surplus in society is, because some would argue that's what zakat is all about. Have we dared, as Muslims, as scholars, as theologians, to give meaning to this concept in its deeper sense? That's justice and the importance of justice. We talked about people are different from us, yet another principle in Islam. And here again, friends, I don't like to single out my own religion, but one cannot deny that of all the religions we know, if you do a proper comparative study, it is Islam that has got the strongest position against racism, against communalism, against xenophobia, hatred. It is so fundamental to the faith. In the Prophet's, peace be upon him, farewell lecture, this is one of the things that he emphasized. No superiority of the Arab over the non-Arab, the non-Arab over the Arab, white over black, black over white, and so on. Islam is so strong on this. And yet we find that we are not in the forefront of this struggle. We are not able to give emphasis to this. In fact, even amongst us, within our own societies, we practice discrimination of different types. Ethnic, racial, discrimination linked to a person's heritage, and so on. And these are things which we should be ashamed of. We should develop a stronger position against this. And again, we hope that because this issue has also emerged in the midst of this calamity, the coronavirus, I hope that we will give more attention to this in the post-coronavirus era. And the last, from an Islamic perspective, the environment. Here again, Islam is so explicit about our relationship with the environment. We are part of nature. We have a responsibility. It is our trusteeship. We have to look after the environment. We cannot ravage and damage the environment. There are also Muslim countries that have paid so little attention to the environment. Some of the most polluted countries in the world are Muslim majority countries, and that I think is a shame. And yet the principles are so clear. In fact, the first scholar from the perspective of social science disciplines to write about this in a profound way was actually an Islamic scholar, Said Hussein Nas, in his book on the spiritual crisis of modern man, where he showed how fundamental the question of the environment, nature is in all our spiritual philosophies, not just Islam, in all the others, Taoism, Buddhism, Confucianism, Christianity, Judaism, all of them, Hinduism. This is a very important principle. So friends, the principles are there, the values are there, but we have not been able to apply them. We have not been able to give meaning to them in the real sense. And there are reasons. If you have to try to explain these reasons, it will take a long while, but if you had to do it in a nutshell, I would say it's always vested interests. Vested interests linked to our own selfish position, because we are self-centered as people, and in spite of our teachings, which are so explicit in fighting self-centeredness and in fighting against the ego and in fighting against the way in which we always sort of place ourselves above everything else, you find that all the while we do it. And that's one of the reasons why we brought all these crises that we talked about, the various dimensions that we described one. So this is what we have to try to overcome. And can we argue that this Corona crisis has perhaps persuaded us to pause and ponder? Because we have brought everything to a halt, maybe just reflect on what we have become, what we are, and ask some very fundamental questions. Is this what we are here for? Selfishness, greed, accumulation, acquisition, trying to aggrandize power, is this what we're here for? Are there other more noble and more sublime goals which are important, which make us human beings, which is basically our trust, our link with the divine, which is why we had taken on this trust, which was a huge trust that we took upon ourselves. The mountains rejected it, but the human being said, yes, I'll take on this trust. But we have failed. After thousands of years, we have to admit this, we have failed. And something like this, a crisis caused by an almost invisible life form, which has brought all our activities that dazzled us for so long to an end, even if it's for a short period of time. Maybe the purpose is to get us to think. But there are two paths before us. Either we think, we reflect, and we try to build anew, return to what we are supposed to be, that this is the whole purpose of life, this is the purpose of Islam, of all the revelations since the beginning of time, or we continue the way we have been. We overcome the crisis, we'll make a little changes here and there, we don't shake hands, perhaps in the future we just hold our hand to our heart, which is not a bad idea. But apart from that, no real changes in terms of class structures, in terms of fundamental communal ties, no changes. Environment, things remain as they are. We continue to support hegemony and to practice hegemony. We continue to misgovern and to destroy. Is that what's going to happen? Which path will we take? The path that requires reflection and a total transformation, which will take a very, very long while, of course, but there has to be a beginning. Are we prepared to say, yes, we have reflected, and we feel that this has to be the beginning, a change, a new way of looking at things, which we are capable of because it has been part of our histories, and we've done it at different points in history, brief periods in history where all these glittering values have come to the surface, and we've lived by them for a while. Do we do that? Create institutions that last, that endure, based upon these values of truth and justice, accountability, love, compassion? Or do we just slip back into what we were and say, well, 2 months, 3 months, 5 months is over, now we continue to accumulate and acquire and destroy? The choice is ours. Why do not feel that confident, friends? That's my concluding remark about the future is, unless and until there are powerful forces that will drive the change we're talking about, I cannot see that happening. Because if you look at the history of change, you will need forces to carry this sort of change forward. Where are those forces? That's the question I want to leave you with. Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chandran. Jazakallah. That was an incredibly comprehensive presentation, and has left us with a lot of food for thoughts. And of course, we do have a tradition of opening it up to questions from the outside world, the millions of viewers that are viewing you right now. But of course, you're very familiar with my own tendency to preempt that beforehand and ask and engage you on a couple of very pertinent issues that you raised. And I'm incredibly pleased that you began with, I think, the issue that is both related, to the specific pandemic of the coronavirus, but is indeed an issue which is the more long-term and perhaps more dangerous issue confronting humanity. We say the long term, but we really don't know what that long term is or medium term, and that is, of course, the environment and the ecological crisis that humanity confronts. And I recently wrote a piece. In fact, it was also for Just as well, in which one of the things that I said was the irony right now, and the sad irony is that while many people are having trouble breathing because of this virus, the earth is finally able to breathe somewhat. Uh, this is the sad irony of precisely what you have been discussing, the situation that we humans have created, that we have abandoned this amanat, the trusteeship of what God has given us in taking care of the planet, and it has taken a huge toll, a human toll, for that planet to slowly recover. Whether it recovers in the long run, we don't know, but at the present moment, it is able to breathe. So I just wanted to point that out. I really appreciated you beginning with that point, because I think it's so central for us to understand the the conditions that we have created, the very betrayal of our faith traditions, be it Islam or all the great faith wisdom traditions of taking care of nature, of our planet, and of being a part of that nature. My first question to you, Dr. Chanda, you of course alluded to a very famous leader who has made these statements of the Chinese virus, the Wuhan virus, defunding the WHO, and so on. And of course, he has some cohorts around him that, like Pompeo and so on, that of course fully endorse all of this. My first question to you, Dr. Chanda, and we'll take it one by one, is: do you see this as simply the ramblings of President Donald Trump and his small cohort of I don't, for lack of a better term, insane individuals that are hell bent on probably the destruction of the human species and the planet? Do you see these simply as the ramblings of them, or is it part of the broader strategy, as you mentioned later on, of the larger geopolitical strategy of course, not just containing. Containing is now beginning to sound like a soft term, but actual moves of aggression towards China. We can go back to, of course, John Pilger's famous documentary, The Coming War on China, and of course a lot of literature written on this. So do you actually see the American national security state beyond Trump, and in fact that has had differences with Trump, now seeing this virus as an opportunity to escalate that aggressive posture towards China, particularly in light of what has been very clearly articulated last year, that in fact the humorous thing about it is that the whole war on terrorism, terrorism wasn't even mentioned once in the Defense National Security document. In fact, it was great power rivalry with Russia and China. That's the main threat to the U.S. empire right now. Of course, they don't call it an empire. So I'm wondering whether you think that this is being used, this will continue to be used as an opportunity to escalate and intensify the war and aggression against China.
Thank you, Junaid. I agree with you that the coronavirus calamity has given an opportunity to some of these forces, and they go beyond Trump and Pompeo and Mike Pence and so on. It is a whole system. One can argue that the deep state, which is at variance with Trump on certain issues because he's unpredictable, and that's what the deep state doesn't like. But on the other hand, the deep state shares with Trump this phobia about China, the great fear about China. And it's more than phobia. You have to see this in terms of the US and the West's dominance of the world for a few centuries. In its most concrete form, the last 250 years perhaps, but it began with Vasco da Gama and what someone described, the Indian historian K.M. Panikar, described as the Vasco da Gama epoch of human history, the beginning of dominance. There was Vasco da Gama, but there was also Columbus on the other side. So this was how it all started. And they had become very powerful, dominated almost every sphere of human existence. And for the first time, mind you, Junaid, for the first time, there's a real challenge. The Soviet Union was not a challenge to the US. They had to sort of magnify, distort the challenge in order to justify their military expenditure and their dominance.
Yeah.
And if you look at countries of the South that had become independent, the non-aligned movement, all these sincere endeavors to bring about a more equitable world, they were not a challenge to US hegemony. But China represents a real challenge for three reasons, a couple of which are not discussed openly, as they should be. It's discussed in some circles. What are the three? The most obvious is China's economic power. It is the factory of the world. It is the nation that organizes the world's market today. One can't deny it. So economically, China is very, very important. And I think this is something which the US and everyone else knows. And the US knows that economic dominance has been very, very important in terms of one's imperial power. And that's threatened, as it were, by what has happened. Number two, China has also, partly related to number one, has become a major force in global diplomacy, providing aid everywhere. It's one belt, one road idea, if you see it from one particular perspective, is actually the most extensive and intensive exercise in diplomacy ever undertaken by any nation in history. Reaching out to so many different countries, so many continents, except the United States of America, right? Reaching out to all these continents, establishing relations, providing some sort of assistance, working together, at times conceding, at other times trying to, of course, further China's own interests. All these things are happening, but basically, this is the art of diplomacy. And the Chinese have emerged as a major player, right at the forefront. And the third thing is this. If you look at economic dominance, more than other types of dominance, what has driven the dominance in history, what has driven imperial power in history is science, is the mastery of science. There's been no imperial power that has not mastered science, whether it is the Romans or if you look at the Greeks at a different time in history, and most of all, if you look at the Muslims. If you look at Islam's power globally, it was because of science. They had mastered science, and science was what drove the Muslim countries. If you look at the earlier trade routes, if you look at the inventions, if you look at the great discoveries, from discovering that it is not the earth that is at the center of the universe, and so on, to everything else, it was science. So mastery of science is very important. The Chinese are no longer a minor player. They were maybe 20 years ago, but today they are a major player in science. Look at the number of scientific articles, journals. If you look at discoveries, inventions, they have discovered the other side of the moon, Chinese. So in terms of science, the Chinese are right in the forefront. So economics, science, diplomacy. And the US knows that it is not easy to hobble, to hamper and hinder China's rising power. Do they want to come to terms with this and say, yes, China is a rising power and we will work together, create a better world, which is, of course, the rhetoric from China itself, we'll all work together. I don't think an imperial power will adopt that sort of approach. They want to continue to be dominant, to be powerful. And now that they feel that their dominance is threatened, they'll do anything to stop this. If you just look at China the last 2 years, the whole question of the Uyghurs, the way it has been exaggerated and distorted, and we know that a lot of it is just propaganda, the treatment of the Uyghurs. It's again part of the attack on China. Hong Kong, much more organized, systematic, trying to undermine, subvert China. And I see this crisis, we don't know what really happened, of course, though there are new articles that emerged suggesting that it is not just bats, it's something else. We don't know, and I don't want to join that sort of speculation. But if it is something sinister, something diabolical, it is just another example of what the US will do to ensure that it remains on the top, that it cripples China. So yes, I think this is the most important political, economic, scientific issue that confronts us.
Thank you, Dr. Chandra. Now, let me get to some...
Anymore,
Sorry?
I don't see on the screen anymore. I don't know. You still see me?
Yes, I can see you.
Hazik?
Well, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, that would suffice.
Yeah, okay.
I think you see me too often. Anyways.
So it's all right, I see.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So we do have a number of questions, but hopefully I could get back to some of the questions that I had for you as well. We do have a number of questions, so I would like to address, or for you to address some of those.
Yeah.
One, I think very pertinent for you in particular is, what is the role of the public intellectual in addressing these challenges, particularly in authoritarian societies where it's not so easy to speak out?
Well, you've given the answer, Junaid. One has to speak up. Yeah. One has to stand up. It's going to be a big challenge. There are risks involved. One has to pay a price sometimes in authoritarian societies, but even in non-authoritarian societies. I don't think, say, a society that claims to be democratic, like United States, even India, if you wrote some articles about the importance of global justice and criticized, say, the role of India or how the United States is helming this attempt to perpetuate power, hegemonic power, I don't think the media will give you much space. I don't think other public intellectuals will be happy, because sometimes the enemies are within the same circle. They will not be happy. Why is this guy talking about these things? Because they would rather that, those who offer fellowships and trips abroad and, other sort of, all the goodies, that those goodies will still be forthcoming. And so the public intellectual, if it's worth his salt, will have to decide. I'm reminded of the challenge that the late Edward Said posed in his writing on the intellectual and the responsibility of the intellectual. Because I think that's what the intellectual has to be most conscious about. He's got a responsibility because of his access to knowledge and because of his ability to think and to reflect upon certain issues. He has to take a position. And I find that even on this crisis, the calamity that confronts all of us, we find that not many intellectuals are speaking up. And there are, in fact, intellectuals who will go out of the way to support a certain position. I'm not talking about things about the sort of drug which Donald Trump is consuming, to ward off. They're not things of that sort, which are really minor and inconsequential, but larger issues like the geopolitics that has become enmeshed with this crisis. My great fear, for instance, and this is where I think intellectuals have to speak up, if geopolitics has become enmeshed with this crisis, is geopolitics going to hamper and hinder the discovery of and the widespread use of vaccine, or even a cure? Is that going to happen? Because you don't know what may happen if geopolitics and other vested interests become overwhelming.
Absolutely. I think that the two, I would just add to that, two fine essays from decades ago still remain as relevant today as they were then. One was, of course, you will be familiar with Noam Chomsky's during the Vietnam era, The Responsibility of Intellectuals, and of course Edward Said's The Treason of Intellectuals, the Trahison des Clercs, his Treason of Intellectuals. These two phenomenal essays, I think, point towards exactly the point that you're making, and we have far too few of such intellectuals who are willing to speak out. But inshallah, our prayers are for more of them to come out and in the public sphere and to speak out, and which requires tremendous courage. And I think that your point is also very valid when we speak about the distinctions that are often made from primarily Euro-America about authoritarian societies versus non-authoritarian societies or democratic societies, etc. When in fact these distinctions increasingly are becoming meaningless. We have, to call many of these Western countries democracies is kind of become a farce, because they're more like Western plutocracies. And you try to speak against the U.S. military in Washington D.C. and you will see what will happen. So it's these types of things are issues in all of these societies, not what we conventionally consider from a discourse of what I call Westernese, of Western kind of language and discourse and narratives around these issues. So I'm glad you pointed that out as well. One of the other questions that we've had asked, actually combining two or three questions, is something that we often hear, quite frequently, in fact, is that the task for Muslims, what is the principal, in fact, task for Muslims today? Is it more to confront the internal dynamics of their societies, whether it is corruption, authoritarianism, the lack of democracy, and so on, and deal with those issues, the internal issues of, say, gender justice, racial justice, and so on? Or is it to confront the global powers, the Western hegemonic powers that are often supporting these regimes, that are beyond supporting regimes, carrying out invasions, occupations, and so on and so forth, and interventions? So this is the question I think that many people have, that, you know, where do we put our principal focus in terms of our activism, and our ability, basically the impetus to social change. So, what would your thoughts be on that?
It's an important question, Junaid. At the practical level, this is the dilemma that many people are faced with, because we have so much time and so much energy,
Yes.
and we have to sort of decide how to prioritize, how to sort of emphasize certain issues at certain points in time, and perhaps de-emphasize others. This is to be left to the good sense, the judgment of individuals and groups at different times. I look at my own example. In the late 70s, the whole of the 80s, I was giving much more attention to Malaysia than to international affairs, though I also talked about international affairs, but it was Malaysia that was my main focus. But in 1992, after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the emergence of a unipolar world sorts, I felt that there was a great need to look at the global situation. And there are not many people who are looking at it, who are sort of applying their thoughts to what was happening at the global level. And since then, the global dimension has taken center stage for me as an individual. And I tell myself there are a lot of people who are focusing upon domestic issues all the while, in Malaysia, as in Pakistan, as in other countries, but there are not many people who look at the global reality. And that suits the hegemon. It suits the hegemon and their underlings and their proxies all over the world, because one is not focusing on them. You're just looking at things that are happening domestically, and sometimes that serves as a distraction. You move away from the other issues and you sort of give the impression, because there are elements from the hegemonic centers of power who sometimes support domestic causes. And they're quite happy to support these domestic causes. And you find that willy-nilly a sort of relationship develops. And that serves their interests. In the end, the one who benefits from that sort of relationship is the hegemon. So yes. I'm very, very concerned about this, and that's why I continue to emphasize global politics, hegemonic politics, and I say, yes, domestic issues are important, and every now and then I do talk about these things, but nonetheless, I would want more people to speak about the global situation at this point in time. And I think we reached a point in Junaid where, whether it is the sudden collapse of the Texas oil market, or it's something else like suddenly investments dry up, in a country, or you find that, there is a war, you find that global issues have a huge impact. You can't
Yes.
run away from it, you can't run away from it. They impact upon the domestic terrain. And therefore, you just have to, take a position. Like, you take the economies of most countries today. How can you discuss these economies in silo, as if they have nothing to do with the global environment? The global environment has a huge impact. Individual domestic economies in the global south don't have that sort of impact upon the global economy, but the global economy impacts upon them. And if you're going to talk about justice within a particular society, you have to address this issue. Suddenly you find that there's increasing unemployment, and that's because global patterns of investment have changed. Labor movements, labor flows have changed. And who suffers? People in that particular society. So I think it is so important for us to be clear about our perspectives. And the global perspective needs more champions.
Thank you, Dr. Chandra. This reminds me of how our good friend George Soros and the Open Society Foundation supporting all sorts of anti-corruption programs, including here in Pakistan. Of course, the Pakistanis have kind of eliminated their presence. I know that in Malaysia it happened quite a while ago, but it precisely reminds me of your point, how this can serve as a meaningful distraction of actually analyzing how global power dynamics are very much enmeshed with the domestic internal situation, economically, politically, and so on. And of course, we have the example of our great, wonderful Prime Minister Imran Khan of Pakistan, wanting to do a tremendous amount of good for the country, but deeply constrained by external forces that are deeply connected to empire, such as the House of Saud and so on, which prevented our Prime Minister from attending the great summit in Kuala Lumpur. So your point, we can offer concrete examples of how this operates in the global sphere. So I'm very glad you raised this issue. The next question, Dr. Chandra, a couple of questions combined, is you spoke about very importantly the strong ethos within Islam of of social justice, and almost an obsession in the Quran with justice, and also anti-racism, and so on. And you also, of course, then mentioned that we have a long way to go in the practice of that in various Muslim societies. And we see divisions within the Muslim world today, the Islamicate world, which are very deep, very deep. They could run along sectarian lines, but often the discourse around sectarianism is a means to camouflage deep political issues that both outside powers are taking advantage of opportunistically. So the question then, Dr. Chandra, is what is the rhetoric around Muslim unity for so long? Do you think that in some ways that rhetorical slogan needs to be dispensed with in some ways, and spoken more about how Muslim societies that are at least striving to do a better job in terms of social justice, anti-racist struggles, gender justice, and so on, getting together not only with other Islamicate societies, but countries from the global south that have a history of demonstrating an anti-hegemonic and a social justice praxis. Sorry, I may have answered the question for you, but but this is what's on people's minds right now when you have Muslim regimes that are clearly aligned with Zionism and empire. How can one expect then other Muslim countries that are totally against this to then unite?
Well, that sort of unity, in other words, regardless of our position on fundamental issues of fairness, of justice, that sort of unity, it doesn't go very far. I think at the level of rhetoric, yes, you can talk about that sort of unity, but in reality, we have to deal with more concrete realities, yeah? And I would regard these as two areas that are important. Yeah? One, what you alluded to, some countries coming together, and I think it began with the G8 initiative. People like the late Erdogan of Turkey, he was involved in this. And they had a couple of meetings and so on. It didn't go very far, but nonetheless, I think that spirit is still there, which is what I think drove Imran Khan and Erdogan and Prime Minister Mahathir to come together. Those countries that are doing something and they've got something concrete to show, they feel, yes, those of us who at the tangible level have been able to do something, we should come together, share our experiences, try to strengthen our relations. So that endeavor has to go on. But at the same time, I think it is so important for Muslim countries to address some fundamental challenges within the Muslim world that affects our unity, that affects our ability to work together, and what is worse, that contributes directly and indirectly to the ability of others to manipulate us. And I'm thinking specifically of the Sunni-Shia divide. We have not been willing to face this. There have been attempts, there have been endeavors here and there, like the Amman message of 2005, which was a good effort. But unfortunately, there was no follow-up, and very soon after that, Muslim countries fell into disarray and the rest of it. But I think that's the sort of thing that we have to face. The issue of this divide within the Muslim world. The more I think about it, I feel that this divide is much more serious than the Catholic-Protestant schism in history. Why do I say this? The Catholic-Protestant schism was not deeply interwoven with global politics, with the whole reality of geopolitics. And today it is so clear that those who want to weaken the Muslim world, they're the ones who want to encourage this dichotomy. They write about it, they speak about it, they make sure that there is no serious, sincere attempt to overcome this dichotomy. And if there is any effort, they undermine it very quickly. It has happened a number of times. So this, we must have the courage. The Muslim world needs not one, but a handful of leaders who say, yes, Sunni and Shia, we must face this. Why is it that we have allowed what was basically a political divide to assume such significance to a point where, it is just like a very deep, festering wound in the Muslim world, and we don't want to talk about it now. So this is where I think courage is needed. The willingness, the determination to face up to this and try to overcome it. And we can do it at various levels. It need not be in the realm of politics to start with. You can have scholars working on this. You can have theologians holding meetings and saying, what is this so-called divine? When you really try to unravel the whole thing and you try to sort of explore this issue in greater depth, you'll find that it doesn't really amount to very much in terms of the real issues that confront the Muslim world. Poverty, corruption, it is not connected with this dichotomy.
Thank you, Dr. Chandra. This may be the last question, and I can actually tie it in to also what I wanted to ask. And of course, it was one of the latest pieces that, of course, I wrote for Just around what you had yourself expounded on in this presentation, and that is that whether this is, which I think it is, but whether it is or not, we probably would, as Muslims committed to social justice, would prefer that it be an age of transition to something more humane and just. That this crisis should compel us to think about those hard questions of how we got to a system that has been so unequal and replete with cruelties and injustices and so on, often perpetuated by Western hegemony with the collaboration of local authoritarian and so on regimes. So the question, therefore, combined with the couple of questions we've had, is what do you see as, and I think you did mention at some point, which was very strange hearing from you, a slight degree of pessimism about where this may be headed. But the trend, where do you see the trends going? During the Corona crisis and post Corona crisis, because of course many people are raising the point that while we are actively calling upon the state and its security forces and the military and police forces to come and aid in managing this crisis, particularly those societies that have been utterly unprepared or willfully unprepared for this crisis. Would this not allow the powers that be, that have now historically been the perpetrators of these cruelties and injustices, to further entrench their control over these societies? Or do you see signs of hope in terms of people's consciousness really developing in seeing the gross kind of injustice that this single virus has pointed to in terms of, who gets access to what, and the all sorts of symptoms of a collapsed system. So in some ways, a kind of short-term prognosis of yours that may not be as pessimistic as I thought it sounded to be in the presentation.
Yeah. Well, Junaid, there are 2 points here by way of response here. If you look at the entire terrain, I cannot see any social group at this moment that would be the harbinger, the herald of change. And you need something like that. Why do I say this? Because if you look at specific periods in history, the nationalist movements that we are familiar with, they would not have succeeded. There weren't this sort of groups which had a direct stake in fighting for independence or greater autonomy and so on. It could have been teachers at a certain point in time. It could have been people in the public services, but there were individuals of that sort which helped to bring about that sort of change. At the moment, I don't see those groups emerging or playing a role. Maybe it will very soon, we don't know. But there is something else, and there's a second point I wanted to make, which shows that it may happen. And this, in a sense, contradicts the first, It may happen. Why? Because if you look at the way in which the United States in particular, its inner weaknesses have been exposed as a socio-economic, socio-political system, right? They've been exposed totally, from its deaths and its infections and, the inadequacy of its healthcare program, its long soup kitchen queues, This is just amazing. It is just amazing. As someone pointed out the other day that this is far more serious than anything that people have witnessed during the Depression. The sight of people who are sort of queuing up for food and, problems of the distribution of basic necessities and things of that sort. In other words, what I'm saying is that the crumbling of the inner system, which is a prerequisite for change, right through history. The Roman Empire had to crumble, the British Empire had to crumble, the Ottoman Empire had to crumble for the change to take place. So that, I think, is going to happen. And in a way, what the crisis has shown is that countries that are better organized in terms of the public sector, that have greater control over the nation's resources, because they've not privatized everything, because there is the state. The state is playing a role. They've not rolled back the state from China to Korea to Malaysia to Singapore, and many other places. And I think one of the most vivid examples would be in India, Kerala, in contrast to the rest of India. Kerala has had, as you know, since 1956, left government in one form or another. Most of the time, they've had very progressive politics, and that's why the healthcare system is good, which is why the education system is good, almost 100% literacy, and so on. So I think people are going to say, yes, maybe there is something that they have to offer. And I think that sort of ideological change may take place. And that may provide that impetus for the change may taking place, both from the crumbling of a system which has not been able to cope. Actually, capitalism is in very deep crisis. It's a very deep crisis. It has been camouflaged and concealed and perpetuated, because of the utter dishonesty in that system. This is what we witnessed, But now, perhaps they can't camouflage anymore. And people are saying, look, there must be an alternative, because what is at stake is human life. It is the very existence of the human race. And that, coupled with the environmental crisis and climate change and other dimensions of the environmental crisis, I think if you put these things together, it's going to be a major crisis. It's not going to happen tomorrow or the day after, but we need people who would try to develop that consciousness, looking at all these crises, play a role, who would articulate the alternative, with courage. This is where your earlier question about the public intellectual comes in. I think that has to be done. You're not going to see it in your lifetime, but I think it is something which we must commit ourselves to.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Chandar Muzaffar, for an incredibly incisive and comprehensive presentation and a brilliant Q&A session. And I also wanted to mention, I didn't mention this at the beginning, but full disclosure that I have, I'll use the word dual loyalty that's used disparagingly and but correctly for these American Israelis, but my dual loyalty to my two families, both at CIGA, where I'm a non-resident research fellow, as well as to JUST, which is another family of mine. So this has been an incredibly exciting experience for me as well. I wanted to announce the next CIGA Ramadan webinar series lecture for tomorrow. That's Challenging Injustice in the U.S. and Palestine, a Legal Approach by Professor Noura Erakat. So that is for tomorrow. We want to encourage everyone during these last days of Ramadan to attend these lectures and to have a blessed experience in these last few days. And once again, to thank Dr. Chandra and Dr. Sami. And I'm glad that I've been wanting for a long time for the two to also meet and engage, and to everyone at CIGA for this event. So, Assalamu alaikum. Thank you very much.